were a fixture at the site. In 1998, he painted this piece, inspired by hip-hop rave, on the side of a trailer at the Glastonbury Festival. The smiley face, the unofficial logo of rave, appears in many of his later stencils. By the close of the 90s, Banksy, pictured here during a trip to visit the left-wing's appetite, was a different breed of graffiti artist. His pieces often included social comments or vaguely political messages, highly unusual for an art form that was mainly concerned with letter forms and striking visuals. Banksy emerged during a time when British culture was changing. Following the arrival of house music from Chicago, the sound systems and free parties of the 1980s had evolved into large-scale illegal raves fueled. A year later, Banksy returned home to stage Banksy vs. Bristol Museum, his largest exhibition to date. The show was organised in partnership with Bristol City Council, once enthusiastic participants in Operation Anderson and scourge of Bristol's graffiti artists. Banksy's fantasy that the rats, the powerless losers, might one day get some good equipment and take over had finally been realised.
For me, the best
desolation that descended on a lot of the UK, no prospects for young people. Some of them turned to heroin. It was a bleak time.
Bristol at the time was suffering from a lot of industries going, unemployment, conflict, there were riots. It was, like much of Britain at the time, quite an unhappy city.
It was still that old British mentality of Friday night, fight night. And it really was. It was that kind of,
desolation that descended on a lot of the UK. No prospects for young people. Some of them turned to heroin. It was a bleak time.
Bristol at the time was suffering from a lot of industries going, unemployment, conflict, there were riots. It was, like much of Britain at the time, quite an unhappy city.
It was still that old British mentality of Friday night, fight night. And it really was. It was that kind of,
3. Banksy staged his breakthrough exhibition, Turf War, a collection of his street work, sculpture, and vandalised live animals, some of which were painted in homage to graffiti folklore.
Cattle, pigs and sheep are the latest raw material for this man. He calls himself Banksy, but that's not his real name. He's a graffiti artist, and he believes that anonymity is essential.
I disguise because you can't really be a graffiti writer. And
it's on the shape of British culture over the past 20 years than anyone else to come from the city. And I bet none of the cops who arrested him can say that.
So the consequence of Operation Anderson was that the majority of the rioters stopped, which was what the authorities, of course, wanted. The other consequence was that those that continued went completely underground and lived completely outside the law. So you had a smaller group of very, very hardcore
rioters of insurgent artists led by Damien Hirst and celebrated as daring and rebellious iconoclasts. But by the early 2000s, Cool Britannia had burned itself out, and the YBA's luster had faded. Big money had moved in, and for many, it was hard to escape the feeling that normal service had been resumed.
The art world is the biggest joke going. It's a rest island for the overprivileged, the pretentious, and the weak. But modern art is a disgrace. Never has
started to appear all over London. A new type of visual language that became part of the fabric of the East End, and which locals came to associate with a single mysterious name.
It's about underground culture, the things that happen to us. But most people have the fantasy that all the parts will come together. That all the vermin will get some good equipment, and then the underground will go overground and tear this city apart.
they'd be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go out and paint some rats. It's like, yeah, we'll come.
And they might have 5 and it just jumped like that. And it, and in the end, when it started to get to like tens of thousands of pounds, I could only do it if I didn't say the full amount that the piece cost. It's like, oh Christ, by the time it's 15 grand, I'm just going to burst out laughing. And it's like, yeah, mate, it's 15. We made it quite difficult for people to buy pieces. And like I said, it was like, I had no plan. I never wanted a gallery. It was just, we just made it up.
To bring together street artists from around the world and make their work accessible to the general public.
I went to pick Banksy up from Bristol and he diverted me and we went to some print place to pick up some prints. So it was a stack of the rude copper prints. And I'm like, so what are you going to do with them? And so I'm taking them to the Anarchist book fair and I'm going to sell them for a £5 each. And I was just like, well, you're an idiot. I'll buy them. I'll sell them for 20 quid. Come on, we can do better with it than that. And then, he kind of came up.
From the traditional gallery experience, they nevertheless remained art exhibitions. The original concept of street art, images placed anonymously and illicitly in public spaces as free art for the masses, had nothing to do with guest lists, celebrity, glamour, and hype.
Street art is the whole thing. It's everything about site, location. It is a democratic art form. It's about feedback. It's all these other things that happen. I mean, site-specific, a lot.
Did graffiti during a trip to New York, adapted the idea of street art to the European tradition of stenciling political statements on walls. His project to bring socially conscious art to the public began in 1981, when stencils of rats started to appear in the streets of Paris.
Black Rat's signature wasn't Black Rat, it was the rat. Rats like everywhere, like running around, and you would see multiple rats on the walls. He was also painting
7 different galleries, putting 7 different works of art up in these galleries. The one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art only lasted 2 hours, which was understandable because it was a painting of a rather posh-looking lady. She had a gas mask on, and that was spotted very quickly. But the one in the Museum of Art, that lasted for several days because it was a painting of a Tesco can of soup, and it looked just like the Warhol cans of soup, and no one noticed it. It was a daring.
The pieces that we sell at Bonhams are pieces that have been purchased. They come with certificates. There's a very traceable or element of a traceable history, if you like, to them. So we're absolutely not encouraging people to remove pieces from walls.
Street pieces are street pieces. They were created and gifted to whatever city they're in. I think take them off the street is morally wrong. They were created for the people to get enjoyment from, not for like one guy to go and pay someone 50.
It kind of distilled his aesthetic. Although it was painted freehand, Banksy stenciled his name along the bottom. If you take Walls on Fire as a comparison, he was still painting traditional New York graffiti up to that point. The Mild Mild West made it very clear where he was going from there.
Banksy's direction of travel was away from graffiti and towards a career as a new type of contemporary artist. In 2000, he graduated from the streets with a small exhibition at the Seven Shed restaurant in Bristol. The show, with its canvassing perhaps a musician or actor. The stunts themselves contained clues. Banksy had launched an audacious game of cat and mouse. At the Tate, he had risked arrest to bring his art to the public. In the Met, his piece had been quickly removed by curators who were sure that it didn't belong in a gallery. And at Sotheby's, Banksy had performed an act of vandalism. And it was with vandalism that it had all started.
And sound system culture, especially in Bristol, both seem to mushroom simultaneously together.
The twin art forms of music and graffiti were personified by the single figure of Robert Del Naja, a founding member of the Wild Bunch. Del Naja, also variously known as 3D, Delge, or simply D, had spent some time in New York during the early 80s, and when he returned to Bristol, he brought graffiti with him.
3D was also arguably the UK.
Then, like affordable art for people.
And public interest in the movement was soaring. Work that in earlier times might have been seen only by a handful of people who passed it on the street could now be preserved and shared online, greatly enhancing the profile of the artist. Banksy was clearly emerging as the most prominent of the street artists. At a time when youth culture was turning its face against governments on both sides of the Atlantic and protesting the war on terror and invasion of Iraq, Banksy's anti-war, anti-authority agit
I stole, and it became my Bible. I was like, oh my God, there's this place where people are painting trains and you don't know that they're trains. I need to do this for some weird reason. Hip hop and rap was being exported from New York. I was listening to Grandmaster Flash and Sugar Hill Gang, and I was kind of into breakdancing, but I couldn't breakdance at all. I wanted to be part of this scene, so graffiti kind of like did it for me.
The History Museum during half term and put this piece up on the wall.
It's not just Banksy, there is a team, although it's Banksy who's got to face up to putting the picture on the wall and possibly getting arrested. One of the gallery invasions, some of his team staged a sort of gay tiff, an argument going on, so that there was a disturbance which allowed Banksy to go and put a picture on the wall.
Once they set things in motion, you know, I was always maybe...
By art. There was loads of cash. They thought this art movement was cool. They understood it a lot more than the YBAs. It was affordable. And we were the cheeky little shits running around London. And people want to buy into that.
We had no idea what we were doing. Pricing-wise, I just made it up as we went along. So my theory was, if someone had 500 quid, they probably got 1,500. So if we did something at 500 quid and it sold out, next time round, it would be 1,500. And then it was like, well, we got 15.
Film and fashion.
It was all happening in Britain. There was a new spirit, a new confidence and youthful energy.
For you as well.
Britain was swinging again. Almost like a replay of the 60s, go-getting, like we're going to take over the world, you know.
The contemporary art scene was dominated by the so-called Young British Artists, or YBAs, a loose group.
Courage, and that really was the beginnings of laying and sowing the foundations for Barton Hill to grow a huge reputation in the city.
The one place in Bristol where you could paint legally all day long on the walls of the ball court, latterly on the outside of the building. It was bliss. It was luxury. We could sit around, take our time. The other thing that Barton Hill Youth Club had was that it backed onto the railway tracks.
Painting safely and legally. The nascent street art movement found a home in Shoreditch, a rundown district in London's East End, where a new underground was thriving.
It was a mixed place where immigrants, people without much money, all could mix. This whole new street...
Imitate them. Being able to put on a party in a house, charging 50p on the door, hiring a reggae sound system from some guys down the road who had some really big speaker boxes, and having an illegal bar in the corner and filling the house with a couple of hundred people was relatively straightforward.
It was no coincidence that the explosion of both graffiti in Bristol at that time and hip-hop culture
at a youth centre was one thing, but it lacked the glamour of New York subway art, the danger, the rush, and crucially, the ability to achieve city-wide renown. The young graffiti writers at Barton Hill used the club as a staging post for bombing raids on trains, buses, and walls across Bristol. and before long, their names and styles became a familiar part of the urban landscape.
You had artists like Inky, Felix, Choro, Era, Chaos, and Shab.
Presented DJing, rapping, breakdancing, and graffiti as expressions of the same hip-hop subculture.
When Tony and Henry created this film, it seemed like it was all together and it was all this hip-hop package. The young kids that received that film around the world decided that it was only one thing. They didn't just do the graffiti, they didn't just do the DJing or the dancing, they had to do it all.
Alongside Style Wars, Henry Chalfant published Subway Art.
And getting stuff out of the country. Getting the photographs and the memory sticks and the laptops out of the country. Getting ladders, getting a car, finding somewhere to stay. We stayed in this hotel and no one had stayed there for like 3 years. I think we did quite a few workshops with like local kids in Palestine. So we used that as a bit of an excuse to like get art equipment in. There's not a Montana shop in Palestine, so you can't just get your mum's credit card and order a load of shit online and it turns up the next day.
Graffiti writers reinvented themselves, and you have people like Costa Revs who started putting wheat pastes up everywhere with all kinds of messaging. And then you have the emergence of people like Shepard Fairey, who also saw the potential of just like putting posters like rock club announcements or punk announcements.
All of a sudden these little rats started to appearing and more people were doing stickers that weren't based around a skateboard brand. There was Shepard Fairey.
Street artist Banksy pulled off one of the greatest pranks in the history of the art world.
It caused a huge stir. I mean, nothing like that had ever happened.
El mondo dell'arte no salía de su asombro y la verdad.
Quello vedete a sinistra, anche questa ragazza che apre la bocca, insomma.
That stunt has already increased the value of that painting up to $7 million.
It plays on people's fears and emotions and what true value is. Where do we place value in society? Who does art belong to?
He created an art history.
Published this video online. In it, he can be seen preparing a custom frame for his painting, Girl with Balloon. The painting is about to be offered for sale at Sotheby's, one of the world's most exclusive auction houses.
At $30,000 here, we go, $32,000.
The event was typical art auction. Banksy's lot was the last lot of the evening. The piece sold for himself to make a statement concerning a people that are not his people, an injustice that's not necessarily his injustice. And so he painted with great clarity what people around the world could imagine are the dreams of the Palestinian people. It showed how powerful street art could actually be if you have the proper context and if you gave a shit.
What Banksy has done in Palestine, for me, is the Waldorf Hotel in Bethlehem. This is a hotel that he calls the hotel with the worst view in the world, in that it overlooks the Israeli wall that they built to separate Palestine from Israel. It marks that whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You walk in and there is a reflection.
By transforming a clothes shop owner named Thierry Guetta into a celebrated street artist from whom people were prepared to buy millions of dollars worth of work, irrespective of its quality. Conversely, a stall that Banksy set up in New York's Central Park, offering his work for $60 a piece, failed to do much business. Without the art industry to hype them, the canvases were largely ignored. A tourist from New Zealand who purchased 2 pieces at the stall was later able to sell them for $100.
It's kind of funny, oh, he's having a pop at the government. Your older brother was into Damien Hirst and your younger brother who's necking pills and going raving is in a Banksy.
The art world completely ignore it because it's a populist art form. And I think the art world hate that. Populism isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean something's crass and shit. Sometimes it just means that people like it. This was like a movement that became powerful through the people.
Pushed one of the august institutions of the art world. 15 years earlier, in the winter of 2003, a mysterious figure entered Tate Britain, one of the UK's most prestigious art museums, and placed a painting on the wall. Over the following 18 months, fake exhibits appeared in London's Natural History Museum, the Louvre in Paris, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, all covertly installed by the same anonymous stranger.
He went through
doing it for the recognition and not the rush.
Running around a city and getting your name up in as many places as you possibly can. The more risky, the better. You want your name as big as possible in lights, you know. So it's fucking ridiculous, but.
Graffiti is always the heartbeat of society. It captures what's going on.
Pure evil. Invader, a French artist named after Space Invader, he put these small tiles in cities across the world. People like that were making the difference.
The Banksy Effect has kind of leveled out the playing field. So it's like, if an individual says, I can't afford six-figure
art, drawing chalk outlines of figures and characters on vacant advertising boards in the New York subway and attaching mock headlines to lampposts around Manhattan.
Basquiat and Keith Haring were really the beginning of street art, modern street art as we understand it, in that it was taking the tools and the philosophy and the kind of ethos behind graffiti, but stepping to one side with it. Statements that have more to do with newspaper headlines.
Stark difference from the Palestinian plight and from what was happening there. Looked nothing like what he painted.
Certain people were becoming a lot more kind of like understanding the way that the PR machine works. So it wasn't until we came back that those images became political. And there was the message behind what we were doing. If Banksy painted a big wall in London, then maybe the...
Didn't sell another painting for the next couple of years. He enjoys some of it, but doesn't like what comes with it some of the time.
When I was at the airport, I saw it was either on the Banksy shows on the front covers, like either like okay, hello, and you're like, wow, that, you know, this has just gone nuts.
Banksy's soaring profile completely upended the established order in the art world. He was a vandal.
It owes a lot to graffiti, going into Disneyland and handcuffing a Guantanamo prisoner to the railings and getting out without getting caught. The stakes are much higher and the audience is much bigger, but the thinking is largely the same, I think.
I think Banksy was becoming a different kind of an artist. He became this sort of hybrid street artist, social activist, ad hacker, graffiti guy, all into one.
It's painted by an infamous local vandal attracted the attention of both public and media alike.
Excuse me, madam, see this bit of graffiti here with the two rats there and the rat up there with the propeller? What do you think of it?
I think it's most strange.
Can I just introduce you to the man who actually sprayed that thing? Would you call him a vandal?
Well, I suppose you are being a vandal, really.
Graffiti has taken Banksy to cities across Britain as the original street outlaw, but recently he's moved to London, started accepting commissions, and is now holding a conventional exhibition.
What is considered valuable at the time?
See, that is part of the quandary. You're dealing with artists who essentially give their work away, and now you're trying to commodify pieces of it. And that is a challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Sotheby's.
The money was just a byproduct. No one was going out to kind of make money.
People who are in roles of authority that sometimes they feel a conflict with. I'm thinking also of the two policemen kissing, and that being something to think about policemen in a different way, maybe, than we sometimes do. He is wanting to uphold the beauty and power and selfhood of the everyday person, in contrast to institutional systems that are kind of weighing things down and controlling things.
He's reflecting the anti-capitalism, the anti-authority, the anti-war feelings which were prevalent among the Bristol underground at the time, and a genuine belief that the world could be changed to be a better and fairer place.
At the same time, Banksy was evolving stylistically. Stenciling, a technique that had notably been favoured by Robert Del Nair, became an increasingly important part of his work.
Something.
Fancy kid hanging around saying, can I spray something as well? And was largely ignored until he just hung around so much that eventually they relented and he started working with Dry Breads or Bad Apples crew, which were essentially the same crew.
I think they probably all came together around the same time, probably slightly dismayed that people had actually been able to be put off painting by what happened during Operation Anderson. But I'm sure it made a young Banksy more determined to get his work out there.
They very quickly
You see your train running, you know, just the terminology. I saw my train running. This isn't a train that somebody catches to work. This is my train with my name on it, and it's running. Graffiti gives these young individuals some kind of ownership when they have nothing.
It's a matter of bombing, knowing that I can do it, you know? Every time I get in the train, almost